First, let me introduce Susan Ball, one of our panelists, who comes to us live from the UK. Thank you for joining us, Susan. Currently a board member with me at the Gambling Group. Thrilled that you're here, and also has significant public and private company experience in a CFO capacity. So she'll come at it from a different angle as well. Bob Farrell, Chairman and CEO of GlobalTranz, longtime Edison Director, currently on at least one Edison board, GAN Integrity that I know of, and has been on many others. Bob, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Momentarily, Mark Baumgartner, who is a longtime EDN as well, formerly the CFO of Liberty Tax, and currently the chairman of BFS, as well as a board member of NEAT, both Edison companies, will join. And in the meantime, I'm going to just hand it over to Jean-Marc again and ask him to launch right in, and hopefully Mark will get live on the platform in a moment.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. So I think this is actually a perfect continuation of the session we just had, and some of the questions and topics that came up were definitely topics we want to continue to dig into and explore in this session. But the first thing I would want to do is level set with you guys as board members, and kind of, how do you define what the annual operating plan process is? I mean, do we all agree on what an annual operating plan looks like from a board perspective?
Shall I launch in there, Jean-Marc?
Absolutely, Susan.
I think it's very important to sort of define, we're talking about these annual planning things, what is it? What does it mean? Everyone's used to having, an annual budget, and they're probably used to having a strategy discussion once a year, annual offsites, that kind of thing. I think the annual operating plan is almost the bridge between the two things. So it's drawing up and agreeing a manual for how we're going to run our business for the coming year. And that's sort of derived from the overall strategy, the longer term thinking, but it gives each function, each person in the business. And I loved Amy's points about the cascading down idea. Once we've got something at the top for the manual of how we run our business for the upcoming year, and then that itself translates into the financial and the budgets and the targets and the numbers that we then measure it by. So for me, it's the operating manual for the year ahead.
How do you think about it, Bob?
Yeah, I would agree with Susan. And for those of you who follow Yogi Berra, he's got a great quote that if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And I think that there's been a lot of companies that haven't really figured out how they were going to achieve the value that they wanted to achieve, how they were going to do it, what talent they needed to get in place, where they were going to find that talent. Those are all things that are hard to do when you're working in the business every day and fighting the fires and dealing with the customer situations, dealing with the technology challenges. In addition to the things that Susan said, for me, the annual planning process, which is very fluid, as Amy discussed during her comments, is really an opportunity to lift your head out and think about things that you could do with the business without the filter of the 55 emails that you got from customers this morning and the voicemails that are piling up and all those things. So to me, it really is a blueprint, and a blueprint that helps you understand where you're going and how you're going to get there. And to the point of cascading down, in my experience, building an annual operating plan for the board or for your investors that's separate from what you're using inside the company is a huge mistake. And I've been handed those kinds of documents before as a new board member, only to find out that the only people using that document are the board. And if you go down below the CEO, you find out people are working off of other documents and other plans. So having alignment between the board and management that you're working on the same blueprint is really important.
Yeah, that's so critical. And one of the things in the same context, in order to achieve that alignment, there's also a very fine line about the level of involvement that board members themselves want to have as part of the process, right? And you saw in our process that we're involving pretty meaningful numbers of board members, directors, analysts, etc. But at some point, when does it stop being the board's responsibility to drive the process? And so one of the expressions that we use a lot, particularly in public boards, to define the role of directors is, they should be noses in but fingers out of the business, right? Noses in meaning, they really need to understand the key driver, the strategy, but the operations are really not the department of the board. How do you think it's still the right analogy for your role as a private company director? I'll start with Susan, because you have a lot of public experience as well.
I think, yeah, I like the quote. I think in a way I would say the role is not so much noses in, but eyes up, and definitely fingers out. And, who's driving the annual operating process? I think that should very much be the executive team. And they should use the board then as and when required to get the best from them. But I think rather than noses in, which sounds a little bit like, the board member should just come in and pick holes and, criticize and say, this is not right. It's actually eyes up in terms of getting the team to lift their eyes up and think outside, the current environment, just to really look forward and be a bit more visionary about the whole thing, but to lift it really. So it's kind of eyes up rather than noses in.
Yeah, I think that, one of the big differences between a private company and a public company is that the level of governance that you need to provide in a private environment, although not hands-off, is a lot different. I think you both have been directors of public boards as well. And in those situations, you spend a large part of your time on all these governance issues that really don't add much value. So, in a private company, it actually gives the board member an opportunity to bring their experience to bear, to help the CEO and to help selective management team members with your network, with things that have worked for you and things that haven't in the past. But your job isn't to run anything. And I know personally, I've been the victim as a CEO with a board member who was recently an operator. And it's difficult for those operators to make the transition to board member. And they're used to calling the shots, directing things, making decisions. And as a board member, you have to step back and provide that nose in, as your analogy suggests, versus, turning the dials and trying to shift the business around. So in the example that I just mentioned, I talked to the board member about that and explained to him that his job was to help me from a strategic perspective, not from an operating perspective. And he figured that out. But I think that you have the converse problem sometimes with some CEOs who feel that particularly the independent board members who have been appointed by various investors are there to check up on them for the investor and to see what's really going on in the company and report back. And I don't think that in the annual planning process that kind of a thing plays a role. It's the independent needs to act like an independent. They may have been appointed by an investor, but to bring their value to the table in a very strategic way, I think is important.
That's awesome. I think that the key element of what I'm hearing is also something that Susan mentioned in one of our prep conversation, which is CEOs should really spend a lot of time learning how to leverage board members as weapons, using your board as a weapon to drive results. What did you mean by that, Susan? What are some examples of things that people can do to really leverage their board as a weapon?
I guess it's just, working out, as long as the team know where it is they want to get to, working out how any of those board members can then add value. Nobody wants to sit on a board, even public ones these days, just ticking the boxes for corporate governance sake. Everybody wants to, well, certainly in my position, I want to add value. I want to be able to give something extra to the business. So I think for the CEO who wants to use them as a weapon, if you like, it's just working out any of the environments they might encounter or issues each day, how each of those individuals might help, either from an experience point of view, either from a practical experience, or just I always think compiling quite a diversified board is useful. And so bringing board members in that just have a different way of looking at things, that have been in a different geography, different sector, different scale, size, whatever. But it's all part of the being transparent, I think, with your board members. They should be seen as, they're there as part of your army, part of your toolbox. Pick on each of them for their skill set or their experience or whatever they can bring, and use them frequently. Again, it's another conversation, isn't it, as to how often you check in with the board, perhaps with your annual operating plan process. But I think I always say to any of the boards that I work with, I am there any time of day or night if you want to pick up the phone and chat anything through. It's absolutely just the way I want to do it, and so that's using me as a weapon.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think a lot of you know Flint Lane. Flint is the CEO of BillTrust, former Edison company, and I have to say he's probably the best CEO that I've met who knows how to weaponize his board. And he lets you know that, during the recruiting process of those early discussions, that his plan is to leverage everything that you've got, and at the point at which you are no longer able to offer any value to his company, then he's going to find a new board member. And that's fair, right? You're bringing a set of, it's a set of skills that you're bringing to the table that, may suit the company well during one part of its growth phase. And when it goes to the next level of growth, you may or may not fit into that. And that's not a negative commentary on anybody's skills. It's just the changing landscape of any company. So I feel very much like Susan was saying, that I want to bring value to the table. And if you're not able to bring that value to the table in a way that it's a weapon for the company, you're probably not the right board member for that company.
Yeah, 100%. So, thinking about it from that perspective, and I see we have a question from Dunstan about conflict between independent board members and lead PE VCs. We'll come back to that. Let's put a pin in it. But from the perspective of the annual planning process itself, right, as directors, if you were to really be ruthlessly prioritizing and only get the answer to 3 questions you could ask about the business, what would those questions be? What are the top 3 things about the business that you would want as a director to see answered through the annual planning process? That's hard, right? Because we all have 100 questions, but you need to pick the top 3.
We do, and Jean-Marc, I think it's, in my experience, it's a cliched one, but it's a simple one, and simplicity for me is key. But it's like, where do we want to be? Where do we want to get to? What is this business going to be in a year's time? And how will we know when we get there? How are we going to measure it? I mean, I ask this in any kind of strategic session, and it sounds like old hat, but and then the AOP is and how are we going to get there? And that's what my AOP will tell me. That the team will understand it, the board will understand it, they understand what they're trying to be, what it will look like when they get there, and how they're going to do it.
Yeah.
Simple.
I agree with that. And then, not to get down the financial part of an annual planning exercise too early in the cycle, but I do think that as you're answering that question, Susan, you need to consider where your investors are in the life cycle of their investment. Because if you got an investor who's 5 years in and they've built a plan around 6 years, and you're hitting the metrics for them to get out, or you're running out of money and you're going to need to do another round, I think you have to balance some of the thinking about where do we want to go with what are our capital and liquidity, what is the capital and liquidity environment that we face, particularly this year, where I'm sure that I know for a fact that a lot of AOPs got sidetracked by COVID, and this was not the year to be in the hospitality world for sure, and a lot of those companies' revenues just went away. So how do you if your annual plan says X and now all of a sudden you're trying to figure out how you stay afloat from a liquidity perspective. Do you have a balance and a plan from the get-go how you would think about that?
Yeah, that's critical. Go ahead, Susan.
I think that's a very good point, Bob, and I think it also speaks a little bit more to alignment. And I know we spoke a lot about alignment, but it's understanding, and again, that's through transparency, communication. If all members and stakeholders are talking, then there's no reason that alignment's essential. I'm sure.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of times.
No, go ahead, Bob.
No, I think a lot of times you see situations where the CEO's alignment with the investors gets out of whack, and the CEO's vision of where he or she can take the company is perhaps grander than what the investor's view is. And that in order to get there, the investor may have to wait longer, deal with dilution from new investors coming in. And so the annual planning exercise is an opportunity from an alignment perspective to say, you know what, investor A, we got to exit you because we need to bring a new investor in who can help us achieve this thing that we've defined as our goal. And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's very, very hard. I think that's a great segue. I'd love to spend the rest of the session talking about alignment, because as we said in the earlier session, it's such a sensitive concept and so hard to define. But can you, what are good examples in your experience, the board you've been on, of things that CEOs can do well to create that kind of alignment with their board, with their stakeholders? What are a couple of examples that come to mind if we pull on that thread a little bit?
I think it's for me, there are more examples of where there's been lack of alignment, and that's the easier one to give examples of. But I mean, achieving that alignment with your board, again, it's my sort of 3 key words are about communication, transparency, simplicity. If you've got to sum up, if you've got a strategy, if you can't explain it in 2 or 3 sentences, then it's too late. It's got to be simple. It's got to be clear. You've got to be able to communicate with all of the stakeholders. And I guess, do you measure it's aligned? I guess if everyone's happy at the end of the year that, they've achieved what they set out to achieve.
Yeah, Bob, before you jump in, I want to pick on Susan a little bit more. So you said you had more examples of situations where alignment was missing. So can you share, maybe without naming names or calling out people, an example of a situation like that, and more from the perspective of, how did you see it play out? What was your role as a board member in the misalignment? And with hindsight, what could your CEO have done differently to prevent that misalignment? We'd love to hear that.
I think the particular example was where the founder CEO, still actually had a controlling interest, but had a couple of growth fund or equity people at the table. And the plan that was communicated, it was more of a longer term 3-year strategy. And the idea was to grow the business. It was very fast growing, but was to spend 3 years capitalizing on that growth, putting all the right structures in place. And then at some point, then there would be an exit. So this very much speaks to Bob's point about, aligning the CEO's aspirations with the VC or investors at the table. And in this particular instance, there was a lack of communication and transparency, I think, when the aspirations of the CEO started to change. And instead of bringing that up with the other people around the board table, especially the independents, we kind of ended up going through a process of, almost, here's an offer on the table, this is what we'd set out to achieve. And there was a change of mind, and that was not then going to get voted for. So it felt a little bit like, because we had got a plan set in place, but because changes in the way people's expectations weren't then communicated with the rest of the board, we couldn't then achieve the best for either that particular CEO or the investors. And it was a little bit, back to the drawing board.
Right. Bob, what about your experiences?
Yeah, I think that, we're leaking a little. I mean, all this actually ultimately does contribute to the annual operating plan, but some of it is kind of like surrounding. To me, the alignment starts on the day that you either take the job as the CEO or the day that you take the money from the investors. And no investor makes an investment in a company without building out a model, without building out a returns scenario. And it's important for the CEO to understand what that expectation is, because unless you maintain a controlling ownership and the new investor doesn't have a way to block you or has a majority or whatever, you do serve at the pleasure of the investor, and your job is to drive shareholder value. Sure, we want to create market leadership, technology innovation, make customers happy, serve our communities well, all the important things that we put into our annual plans. But at the end of the day, we have to get a return for our investors. And so to me, I spend a lot of time not only around the AOP process, but in between board meetings, having these conversations. Susan used the word transparency, just being very transparent about where my head is at, where their head is at, and how this is going to translate into our annual planning exercise, so that what we say we want to do and how we're going to do it and how much money we're going to spend to do it is understood by all and can't be disputed, unless the facts change, which is always a possibility. And this has been the poster year for facts changing.
For sure. So I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions as well. But I want to go back to the question from Dunstan, which is, how do you address and how do you deal with conflict or misalignment between, for example, the PE VC owner, the independent director, and the management team? What sort of conflict resolution mechanisms have you used? Should there be conflict as part of the process? What are your views on that?
I think conflict sometimes can be healthy. It does ensure that everybody on all sides thinks about it from all points of view. I don't have any particular resolution mechanism. It would just be a case of mediating, trying to understand everybody's side and just trying to find the common ground.
Well, I think that, one of the things that Edison does with the EDN is put independents in roles where they can help bridge the gap between the investor view and the management view. And I'm involved in two situations right now where, there's a little bit of a disagreement about, how we should go forward. And both parties have reasonable views as to the way forward. And I think that what the EDN network does as independent directors is sits in the middle of that and can sort of mitigate and help get alignment and make sure that the debate is healthy versus hurtful to the company, and that it stays, appropriate, and that you don't have management saying, hey, we're going to take our ball and go home if you don't go our way. And the investors saying, well, if you don't go our way, we're going to fire you, because neither of those things generate the outcome that anybody wants.
So I see Chris is itching to jump in, but I do want to ask one last question before we hand it over, which is something that I'm sure a lot of the CEOs in the room want to know. What are your biggest pet peeves about things that CEOs do during the planning process? Can be small, can be big, just tell us.
I think Amy hit the nail on the head when she just said it forced us to put pen to paper. And I think a lot of CEOs just think, hey, look, we know what we're doing. We told you what it's all about. And it's like, yeah, but can you just write it down? We need a reference point. We need to be able to look back and, measure and at any point pick up again, so that everybody's crystal clear where we're going and what we're doing. And I think, yeah, my pet peeve would be that sometimes not something they see great value in, but it has huge value.
My pet peeve is a pretty simple one, and that is that too many CEOs spend too much time talking about what they've already done. And all congratulations in the world to everything you've ever done, but we're moving forward now. So what are we doing next? And congratulations, let's move forward.
That's awesome. Well, thank you
Well
both.
said, Bob. Can you hear me, Jean-Marc?
Yes, absolutely, Chris.
I just want to thank you all. Fantastic session here, and back to Amy and you, Jean-Marc, on the one prior. Bob and Susan, great words of wisdom. Please feel free, folks out there in the chat landscape, if you want to connect to any of these people. I know Greg says great things about Susan. I've had the pleasure with both Jean-Marc and Bob, knowing that they're sort of entrepreneur, founder, management team first. So I know they're ready, willing, and able to help on some of these things. We didn't get the compensation. Maybe at some point in the future, we'll have that conversation, because I know that's always an interesting balancing act as well that Bob has some great experience with. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time with us today.